Welcome to the Harvard Art Museum's and tonight's lecture, The Peculiar Problems of Preservation, Life, Death, and the Afterlife in the Museum. My name is Rebecca Dolan, and I'm a senior living in Adams House, concentrating in English.
My name is Natalie Gale, and I am a sophomore living in Dunster House, concentrating in history and literature and visual and environmental studies with a secondary in economics. Rebecca and I are members of the Harvard Art Museum Student Board and are delighted to welcome you to the museums on behalf of our student community.
Please now take a moment to turn off your cell phones and help me to warmly welcome Narayan Kandekar, Director of the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies at the Harvard Art Museums, who will introduce tonight's program.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. It's so nice to kick off a program with the enthusiasm of the students that really make this institution what it is. So, as you heard, my name is Narayan Kandekar. I'm the director of the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies. I'm also senior conservation scientist and director for the Center of Technical Study of Modern Art, which means I'm really a jack of all trades. I want to start off by saying thank yous first, because I believe it's important to acknowledge the people that make this happen. So I want to thank the M. Victor Leventritt Fund for its support, which was established through the generosity of the wife, children, and friends of the late M. Victor Leventritt, class of 35. And the purpose of the fund is to present outstanding scholars, which we have here tonight, of the history and theory of art to the Harvard and greater Boston communities. I also want to thank my colleagues in the Strauss Center and the Division of Academic and Public Programming, in particular Dr. Giulia, Beale Family Postdoctoral Fellow in Conservation Science, and Jen Thum, the Inga Maren Otto Curatorial Fellow, who put in so much of the legwork that was needed to make this happen. I also want to thank our director, Martha Tedeschi, for her sustained support of conservation and technical studies as an equal contributor to the understanding of works of art. Without her encouragement, this lecture would not be taking place. The Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies was founded 90 years ago and is the birthplace for technical art history and modern conservation as we know it. We're standing on the shoulders of our professional giants, people like Edward Forbes, George Stout, John Gettens, Betty Jones, and Alan Burrows. We're proud to continue in their spirit of innovation. And part of that has been teaching. It's always been part of the fabric, and the Strauss Center has always taught classes that have been taken by art history students who move on to bigger and greater things, people like Jim Cuno, Tom Lentz, Michael Brand, and Glenn Lowry, to name a few. We also train young professionals in conservation, and we've had over 150 fellows work with us since 1976. The fellows play an important role in the life of the institution, and one of our fellows, for example, Jens Stenger, went on to be the principal worker on the Rothko Murals project, which many of you saw in the opening of this building in 2014-2015. And one of our recent groups of fellows, Madeline Corona, who did the incredible restoration of the Hans Arp relief that you see upstairs in the galleries, has just started a permanent job at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. And tonight I'm very pleased to welcome back one of our previous fellows. Sanchita Balachandran is the Associate Director of the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum and Senior Lecturer in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins University, where she teaches courses related to the technical study and analysis of ancient objects and the history, ethics, and practice of art conservation. Her undergraduate courses always incorporate close examination of ancient objects from the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum using non-destructive examination techniques. Recent hands-on courses include ancient colour, the technologies and meanings of colour in antiquity, and recreating ancient Greek ceramics. A recent exhibition, Who Am I? Remembering the Dead Through Facial Reconstruction, involved collaborating with a multidisciplinary international team of specialists to reconstruct the faces of two ancient Egyptian women in the care of the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum. Sanchita trained in conservation at the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, as a conservator specialising in archaeological materials, and has completed projects at several museums, including the Smithsonian, Harvard Art Museums here, the J. Paul Getty Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, amongst others. She's also been actively involved in site projects, and these have been in Egypt, Cambodia, Tunisia, Italy, and India. In 2009 to 2010, she spent 8 months in India under the auspices of a Fulbright Award researching the history and conservation of medieval South Indian bronze sculptures. She's a fellow of the American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works. She's currently director and founder of Untold Stories, a non-profit organisation that pursues an art conservation profession that represents and preserves a fuller spectrum of human cultural heritage. So Sanchita was a fellow here in the Objects Lab in 2003 to 2004. And during that time, she impressed us greatly with her fearless approach towards morally challenging issues. She researched the murals from Dunhuang that Langdon Water brought back to Harvard in 1924. And this removal of the walls, Sanchita explained, compromised the integrity of the cave murals, the extracted murals themselves, and also the opinion of Harvard by the local community. Despite the fact that this work had been done with the best intentions at the time. Sanchita went on to a Getty-sponsored meeting on the Silk Road at Dunhuang itself in 2004 and took that research with her. We support our fellows undertaking these kinds of very challenging, very, very difficult projects. And I've watched her over a number of years give presentations, and some of the notable ones have been a keynote presentation at the Montreal AIC conference in 2016, Race, Diversity and Politics in Conservation, our 21st Century Crisis, which received from our notoriously taciturn profession a standing ovation. And the following year, she continued to tackle the difficult topics by organising a facilitated conversation about inclusion and equity in conservation and preservation, teaching us all that some kind of discomfort has to be experienced before we can move forward. It's something that came as a surprise to many people who think that museums are operating in a post-racial environment. She's now undertaking doctoral studies at the Winterthur University of Delaware program with a thesis entitled Identifying Authorship Through Technology, Ancient Greek Ceramics. This research looks at ways that the production technologies of ancient Greek vases may in fact give us a clearer sense of the authorship of these extraordinary objects. And she'll be working with 15 students tomorrow as she leads some very close looking at Greek ceramics from our collection. But tonight, Sanchita is here to present her lecture, The Peculiar Problems of Preservation, Life, Death and the Afterlife in the Museum. Please welcome Sanchita Balachandran.
Hello, can you hear me? Right. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the ancestral homeland of the Massachusetts people, and I respectfully ask their ancestors and descendants for permission to speak here. I also ask for safe passage of other ancestors whose stories I have the privilege of sharing. I want to thank, with all my heart, Narayan Kandekar, director of the Strauss Center for Conservation here, and Martha Tedeschi, director of the museum, for inviting me to speak here. I'm grateful to the family and friends of the Harvard alumnus M. Victor Leventred, who's already been mentioned, who established the fund that supports this lecture. It is truly such an honor to be here. And I especially give my thanks to Julie Wirtz, Alison Maria Cariens, Molly Catherine Ryan, Jessica Levin Martinez, Angela Chang, and Jennifer Thum for their warm welcome and all of their work in making my visit here possible. Though I have the privilege of sharing this work with you today, I want to be clear that this is the work of many hands. Here are the names of the people and institutions who have contributed in innumerable ways to the 3 projects I will discuss today. The first time I applied to Harvard in 2002, I was rejected. And by apply, I mean applied to be a fellow in the Strauss Center for Conservation here at the Harvard Art Museums. At that time, all of us graduate students in art conservation talked about this place in awed whispers and only 2 words, the Strauss. It was a temple to the art and science of art conservation, a sacred place of pilgrimage and study. Not only was it renowned for its extraordinary museum collection and superb teachers, it had something that practically no other museum laboratory in the entire country had: natural light. Light that filtered through actual windows that even overlooked Harvard Yard. Now, most museums still situate their conservation laboratories and studios in dingy basements, far from the seeing eye of not only museum visitors, but seemingly even other museum staff. But the Strauss was literally at the top of the museum. You ascended to it and could peek in through glass windows to see people working with their tools, doing things with important art, bathed in the glory of actual, honest-to-goodness light from the sun. But as I said, the first time I applied to Harvard, I was shown the glories of this place and then summarily rejected. But I'd seen the place, and I couldn't unsee it, and so I reapplied, and the following year I had in my possession a crimson plastic card that literally opened up the world to me. It was the first time that I'd been embedded in the workings of a university museum, and it is only now that I've spent the past 9 years as curator and associate director of another university museum, the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum, that I realize how peculiar and wonderful university museums are. But working at the Strauss was the first time I encountered the notion that things in museums are most fundamentally things to teach with, to learn with. And museum objects were less things than places, surfaces, loci, where questions could be asked and new discoveries could be made daily. Living with a museum collection in a university context is particularly powerful because the past feels alive here, and the people of the past seem to walk among us, and the people of the future, the ones who will come through these same spaces, seem poised just outside the door to walk in. I think I especially felt the sense of collapsing and expanding time here because I spent time in the museum's archives, encountering some of the most important figures in the history of museology and conservation, people who walked, worked, and talked in these very halls. It gives me a great sense of joy to be back where Edward Waldo Forbes directed the then Fogg Art Museum. Having spent some time reading his letters, I feel I know him somehow, and his visionary belief in the power of art objects as pedagogical tools, and his insistence on the regular practice of making things as a way of knowing them guides my own work. I also met Rutherford John Gettens, the Harvard chemist Forbes hired for his Department of Technical Research, now the Strauss, in 1928, who remains for me, and I think most of us who work in the field of art conservation, a kind of conservation oracle. Because Gettens knew things. In fact, he seems to have known everything, researching and publishing on an astonishing variety of materials with an insatiable curiosity and analytical interest. And so it was hardly surprising that 7 years after I left Harvard, Gettens turned up in India, in an archive I was studying. One of his letters in 1933 to a Dr. S. Paramasivan, chemist at the then Madras Government Museum, asks about the, quote, peculiar problems, unquote, of preservation in South India. Almost 90 years ago, Gettens already knew then that what art conservators and conservation scientists did was peculiar, and that there were peculiar problems we are asked to confront. In the correspondence between Gettens and Paramasivan, there's an obvious sense of relief for both men when they find each other as kindred spirits in their work. There's a genuine eagerness, but also, dare I say, solace in their sharing of their tools, techniques, scientific concerns, but also an excitement about the strange work of discovering things on ancient surfaces. This same sense of shared community, actively engaged, supportive, and excited by the possibilities of museum collections, is what I most associate with my time at the Strauss. I'm most grateful to all the people here, so many of whom are in this audience, who made this place such an exhilarating space to be in. I also want to acknowledge my gratitude to others I came to know during my time here. Craigen Bowen, paper conservator and former deputy director of the Strauss, whom I think of still bustling through the lab with her characteristic resolve and fortitude. And Stina Rossel, who was then finishing her PhD in zooarchaeology, whose iPod provided the soundtrack for my time here. I dedicate these remarks to them as a small token of gratitude wherever they are in the afterlife. I've already told you about old letters I've read, and I'd like to begin this exploration of the peculiar problems of preservation by sharing an exchange of letters between Dr. Frederick W. Graver, then superintendent of the aforementioned Madras Government Museum in South India, and a Miss Alice Munro, a registered nurse with the Canadian Baptist Mission in Sarango, Ganjam District, Orissa. You see the two locations. This is Madras, and there's Orissa. The letters, dated to September 1940, concern an unusual museum acquisition. Thank you for the 2 spiders safely received. The mature one I have preserved, but I still have the young one alive. They belong to the tree and thatched roof-hunting genus Poecilotheria, which sometimes preys upon small birds. We have no examples of this species in our collection, so are very glad to have these, but our grant for purchase of specimens is not large enough to enable us to purchase much more beyond archaeological specimens, and we rarely purchase zoological ones. This year, most of our grant has already been pledged for the acquisition of bronze treasure trove images. If you can secure a male spider specimen, it will be particularly appreciated, as the male usually has the best specific characteristics. Give you a spider warning. This is the Poecilotheria metallica, known for its spectacular coloring. It grows to the size of a human hand and has a bite deadly enough to kill small children and livestock. Now, there's a lot to unpack in Gravely's statement that will help guide us for the rest of this talk. So I hope you'll indulge me as I take this apart a little, because even though Gravely is talking about spiders, and he worked within the context of the British colonial administration of South India, where he ran a museum. He's describing how any museum fundamentally works. First, he differentiates between preserved and alive things in the museum, even if both are fundamentally spiders. And the more mature, or perhaps older one, is more worthy of preservation. Second, he tells us that when these things are alive, they are dangerous, preying upon small birds. Then he tells us in part how the museum works, seeking representative examples to enhance the collection based presumably on some sense of scarcity or quality. We learn the categories that the museum collects, and this is true of museums today. He says they collect zoological and archaeological specimens, but the money for acquisition is set aside for bronzes alone, suggesting a hierarchy or preference for acquisition, though perhaps one he's not thrilled about. And finally, that the male specimens are preferred. And I point this out because the stories I will tell you this evening, based on archival and technical research, are primarily male stories with very few women's voices preserved. So to summarize, we have in this short paragraph an excursus on how collecting institutions work, that they keep some things alive and kill others to preserve them, that living specimens are potentially dangerous, that institutions have specific collecting priorities based on some notion of rarity or importance, and that the things they collect preserve specific stories while others are left out. Alice Munro responds almost immediately to Gravely, sending him 4 days later, as Indian Postal Service, the 1940s, a box of 20 living spiders, adding, quote, "They may, however, fight and kill each other." And then she asks a stunning question of Gravely. "May I know how you kill them to preserve as specimens?" In case you're wondering, Gravely advises her to kill them with chloroform and then submerge them in enough ethanol that it won't be, quote, "much diluted by the spider's juices." One more spider warning. These are the spiders currently on view at the Government Museum, though neither is a spider sent by Miss Munro. And though they're talking about spiders, it strikes me that Miss Munro's question is one that governs what museums are thought to do with the things that enter them. In fact, the museum has a reputation of being a mausoleum where dead things go, or as in this case, living things go to be killed. What has to leave the body of things in order to make them specimens? Are museums just filled with the exoskeletons of once living things? But here's where being with, spending time with, studying things gives me pause, because to work as a conservator, to wield the tools we have, is to have intimate relationships with things, and it makes it impossible to believe in a simple binary of living and dead, because rarely, if ever, are things dead on arrival when they enter a museum collection. Rather, they are of varying statuses, alive, dead, somewhere in between, waiting to be resuscitated, or awaiting the extraction of their juices. The museum and its staff, and specifically conservators with their tools and physical practices of care, change the status of things. You've probably got an image of what a conservator looks like. We've got our tiny paintbrushes or Q-tips or our fancy scientific tools, microscopes, x-rays, lasers, and we circulate these on purpose as well. But most of our tools are more mundane: glues, adhesives, vacuum cleaners, cameras, and the ubiquitous computer and digital database. But we hold fast to our tools because they link us to the bodies of knowledge we claim to know, to practices we've been shown by our teachers and mentors, to sensibilities we've developed about how to do our work. One crucial thing about our obsession with tools is that we look for evidence of tools everywhere. I myself work on archaeological objects from various contexts, and in the absence of living artists or living descendants to consult for decisions about the things I preserve, I look for the presence of ancient people in their tool marks. Because a tool mark suggests someone wielding a tool, someone pressing or changing a surface, someone interacting with a thing in a way that changes the thing and also potentially the person. In archaeology, this awareness of surface changes in response to use is called use-where analysis. But it's hard to categorize what use-where tells us. Often it simply says, someone was here. For the rest of this paper, I would like to consider the importance of this seemingly simple statement. Someone else was here. Because to recognize that someone was here is to acknowledge the truth of someone else's presence and interaction with this thing at another moment in time. And this acknowledgement is important because we've been taught to think that there's nothing particularly fraught about the work of a museum. It's not like we're saving lives. But that moment of acknowledgement of a former presence tells us our work is a matter of who gets to live or who has to die in the museum. But not just life or death are at stake here, but also something beyond. The afterlife. One of the first times I ever thought of an artwork as dead was just upstairs at the Strauss. Francesca Baver, research curator here, had just brought me this object in its shroud-like wrapping paper with the inscription in Rutherford Gettens' own handwriting, facing transfer cloth from Dunhuan, fresco-bearing fragment of the original fresco. At that point, I was already unhealthily obsessed with Dunhuan, an ancient site known as the Caves of the Thousand Buddhas. Located at the last trading point of the Chinese Silk Road before the foreboding Taklamakan Desert, Dunhuan still preserves several hundred painted and decorated caves carved into the mountainside between the 4th and the 14th centuries. And the Harvard Art Museum holds a magnificent sculpture and 12 wall painting fragments from the site, some of which are on view. I was studying the polychromed surfaces of the paintings and was deep in the archival documents of the man responsible for these objects being in Cambridge and no longer in Dunhuan. Langdon Warner, thought perhaps to be the inspiration for Indiana Jones, leaves a controversial legacy. Though credited with saving Japanese cultural heritage during Allied bombing of that nation in World War II, he was also seen in China as a foreign devil on the Silk Road. And I just note that he's holding a tool here. A scholar of Japanese art, an alumnus and former faculty of Harvard, and the former director of what is now the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Warner casts a long shadow. In 1923, he left his position in Philadelphia to lead Harvard's first China expedition with the hope of procuring Chinese antiquities for the Harvard Art Museums. Collecting Chinese objects was, in fact, a major priority, as these materials were not adequately represented, as you can see in this image, in the collection, and there was actually an international urgency to do so, not only for the Fogg, but for many other museums. The political instability of China in the early 20th century had opened up a seemingly limitless treasure trove of sites, and the prevailing Western assumption was that the Chinese were both disinterested in and incapable of caring for this cultural heritage. Given the tumultuousness that marked the end of the Qing dynasty and the creation of the Republic of China, many foreign nations had already made their way to China, carving up the western end of the Silk Road to enrich museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and St. Petersburg. This removal, technically legal, was always couched in the language of preservation, that somehow these things were best cared for outside China, where specialists knowledgeable in their scholarly, curatorial, and scientific care could take care of them. Working on the Warner material here was the first time I had truly encountered evidence of the imperial and colonial programs that have resulted in things leaving the places and the people to whom they belonged to enter a museum collection far away. And I have to express my gratitude to the leadership here at the Harvard Art Museums for being willing to acknowledge the museum's own role. Because as much as nearly all museums participated in policies and practices that removed cultural heritage from their places and peoples, very few institutions have the courage or humility to acknowledge this past. But to return to this object, it was labeled as a transfer cloth and was physical evidence of the tools and practice of physical removal, transfer, of wall painting fragments from the site of Dunhuan to the Fogg Art Museum. This technique of removing paintings from their walls, known as the Strapo technique, had been in extensive use in Europe by the 1920s. Warner had been advised in the use of this method by Daniel Varney Thompson, a student of Edward Forbes. First, the desired painted surface was coated with a dilute layer of glue to consolidate and stabilize it. In the single image we have of Warner's work removing paintings from Dunhuan, you can see the neat rectangle of glue outlining the area he planned to remove. You can see here. After this, a thicker adhesive was applied hot to pieces of cloth which were firmly pasted onto the painting in overlapping layers. And when the glue was dry, the cloth could be peeled away from the wall, taking the painted layers with it. Once back at the Fogg, Thompson would soften the glue and then re-adhere and press the painting onto a new supporting surface. These images show you some of the stages of the removal and transfer process. First, the glue layer, which you've already seen, a more recent post-removal image of the actual site, and then this painting fragment as transferred and actually upstairs in the galleries today. While some paintings transferred easily, others resisted this process, such as this object, which when unwrapped looked like this, hardened, encrusted, and curled over. As I recall, it was Craigen Bowen who advised on how to gently humidify and flatten out these fragments so they could be studied. And in a detail image, you can gain a sense of the topography of the transfer cloth, a bubbled white adhesive, shiny glue, sand grains, brown mud plaster, and patches of pigment. With Photoshop, I was able to reconstruct what these fragments once were, the transfer cloth for a painting now accessioned in the museum's collection as head and shoulders of a Buddhist figure. But what we have now are two partial or shadow images of the same painting. These now two images originally came from Cave 321, and here's the other painting that was removed from this particular cave. And so this transfer cloth preserves not only part of the ancient cave, but also Warner's removal and Thompson's attempted transfer, thus producing a hybrid cultural object that sits uncomfortably as a surface of interaction, of use and wear, marked by all of these people, their tools, and their practices. What do we make of this preservation treatment? It's been easy to judge Warner, but to do so denies a truth that all conservators know. Some things do not survive the conservation process. This is especially true in fieldwork, where even the most robust materials become distressingly fragile. But the very nature of field archaeology is that of purposeful destruction of an intact archive in the pursuit of scientific knowledge, often disenfranchising local and descendant communities from their own past in the name of saving it. So I've come to understand Warner a little differently, in part because he represents much broader concerns about who's allowed to pursue scientific knowledge, even as it destroys other kinds of knowledge, and what new and strange cultural products, like these shadow paintings, are made through those unequal interventions. But in 1924, these were not the concerns of the Department of Technical Research. The staff was under pressure to prepare for the next Chinese expeditions, and Gettens and his colleague, George Stout, were involved in producing new tools and techniques to make the removal of paintings safer. They constructed fake mud plaster walls for practicing the Strapo technique. They wrote a manual describing proper removal procedures. And they produced a portable toolkit, with each kit containing enough material to remove approximately 144 square feet of painted surfaces. I should make clear that Gettens and Stout were ambivalent about these tools. Their stated preference was for objects to be preserved in situ, but their allegiance was also to the object. They had an obligation to save the original object, even if it meant destroying everything that once gave it meaning. This is a familiar and very peculiar problem of our profession. And I've struggled with this image for a long time because I'm drawn in by the beauty of this kit. Its neatly labeled materials in pristine containers, the unused and still sharp tools waiting to be used, the brushes not yet gunked with glue, and the stunning case meant to carry everything together. But I also find this image chilling, even as I know that the subsequent Chinese expeditions failed to collect any additional material for the Fogg, because I'd never thought of the tools of preservation being weaponized before. Reflecting on my own toolkit that traveled with me to many excavations, I'm aware of how many of them were selected by me for the ease of removing things from their resting places. I also think of the cases we now use for transporting our analytical equipment, which are the same cases used by the United States military to transport guns and other weapons into combat zones. So to wield a tool is to know that its use is not neutral. A tool speaks of intention and power, of both care but also potential violence, even as we might think we are doing the right thing. We might preserve even as we destroy. Might there be tools then that take away the potential violence of the hand? Is it possible to conserve without the bias and fallibility inherent in the very human wielding of a tool? This is a question that underlies some of the correspondence between Gettens and Dr. S. Paramasivan, the scientist in charge of the Chemical Conservation Laboratory in Madras, a place we've already visited. Unfortunately, we have no images of Paramasivan at work, but we do have later images of N. Harinarayana, whom I had the privilege of talking with, but I just really love the juxtaposition of these images. In the 1930s, Paramasivan was working exclusively on the preservation of archaeological bronzes. The government museum had over 300 Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain bronze sculptures that were corroding and in need of treatment. Paramasivan was convinced of the need for chemical intervention on these surfaces, but he sought a solution that would treat the underlying causes of corrosion, in this case salts that had penetrated deep into the bronzes. He selected the technique of electrolytic reduction, which was in extensive use at some of the most important museum laboratories in Europe and the United States, with Gettens, of course, at the forefront of this research. In April 1933, Paramasivan wrote to Gettens asking for, quote, all the details about the various scientific methods which you have applied for examining and preserving works of arts and the equipments that you have for them, unquote. I find this request rather poignant, showing Paramasivan's isolation from the centers of conservation science at the time. And Gettens responded warmly, saying, quote, it gives me great pleasure to get in touch with other chemists working in my own field, since there are so few of us and we are so widely scattered, unquote. While Paramasivan clearly admired Gettens, the letters read as a conversation between peers sharing information, commenting on materials, techniques, and analytical tools they recommended, and they describe each other's laboratories and those that they visited. They also discussed the conservation of Asian wall paintings, something that both scientists were working on at the same time, as we've already seen with Gettens, and they exchanged information about the treatment of archaeological bronzes. In only his second letter to Paramasivan, Gettens stated that, quote, it occurs to me that the special methods used to treat bronzes of large size would be an interesting subject for an article by you for technical studies in the field of the fine arts. We should like to hear about your own work there in India. You must have very many interesting and peculiar problems. The paper on bronzes that Gettens hoped Paramasivan would contribute to technical studies, the first scholarly journal in the conservation field, never materialized, but this work was published elsewhere. In those papers, Paramasivan states that this technique returned bronzes to their original metallic condition. Furthermore, the treatment could do things through chemistry that no human hand could. For Paramasivan, the appropriate restoration of archaeological bronzes meant returning them to a shining metallic surface, which is how they appear when they're used in religious processions among their devotees, as seen here. So rather than being shadows of their former selves, the newly conserved bronzes were meant to be lustrous mirrors of their former selves, returned to life through the conservation process. By 1936, Paramasivan had designed a custom-built laboratory for this purpose. Corroded bronzes were first immersed in tanks filled with 2% sodium hydroxide, and electricity was then allowed to run through the tanks using a control panel from the control panel room. So you can see this is the electrolytic cells, which you're looking at here. There are bronzes presumably in here, and there's the control panel room. And then that was fed power from the loud motor generator room, which apparently had a tendency to occasionally explode. When electricity was flowing, the corrosion products on the bronzes were electrolytically, magically reduced to metallic copper. The removal of corrosion in this phase of the treatment was a scientific marvel, a kind of touchless process in which science did all the work deep inside the tank, and thus was a seemingly objective type of cleaning, devoid of all the fallibility of the human hand. The electrochemical nature of this cleaning process also meant that it could remove corrosion from inside the bronzes, places that a human hand could never reach. The equipment was in use all day, 6 days a week, and I imagine a stoic Paramasivan among the cacophonous equipment inspecting his tanks. And indeed, his tanks needed watching because the bronzes and their corrosion were so varied that there was no standard amount of time that a treatment might take. So watching the tanks for the slowing of hydrogen bubbles being produced and responding to the occasional explosion, another explosion, is listed in the notes, was a full-time job. As I told you, conservation tools are dangerous and violent. After this phase of the treatment, the bronzes were taken to the washing room where the metallic copper deposit, described as greenish sludge, could be brushed off the bronzes by Mr. Arokiswamy, seen here. And after washing, the still dull metallic surfaces would be coated with wax until they shone, ready for exhibition. By the 1930s, there were 2 large galleries devoted to these bronzes, a space described by one visitor thus, quote, "The museum was like heaven, all the gods being there," unquote. And in this heavenly place, the work of the conservation scientists' tools made it possible for things to come alive again in unpredictable ways. The Government Museum was an important civic space in the urban center of Madras. As a free institution, it was one of the few spaces of recreation accessible to everyone, and people came in staggering numbers, especially on the festival day of Kanu Pongal. In 1935, 130,000 people came on a single day, this single day. And as reported by British Museum specialist Markham and Hargraves, quote, "The interior of the museum was packed, producing the inevitable accompaniment of fingered glass, beetle nut spit, and dirty marks on the wall," unquote. Despite this patronizing commentary, I find it exhilarating to imagine a museum so well used. In fact, one of the joys of looking at a museum in India is that unlike museums in Europe and North America at this time, there is an expectation that brown bodies will be there, not as specimens themselves, but as visitors. And despite its colonial infrastructure, the Colonial Museum in India is full of real Indian people doing real human things, touching things, complaining about the toilets and the food, and doing things in bronze galleries. My favorite is when a couple was found hastily rearranging their clothing after an amorous escapade behind a glass case with the god Shiva, something the god himself would likely have approved of. And long before the departments of museum education or community engagement existed, the administrators of the government museum sought to have their collections have effects on their visitors, and the preserved bronzes were a significant part of this outreach. Glass plate negatives of bronzes were projected onto an 8-foot wide calico sheet in the museum theater using this lantern slide projector as part of a regular lecture series. What must it have felt like to see gods that you knew in real life looming over you, diaphanous, drained of color, and projected in a shadowy beam of light? And what if the exhibits could talk again? Because in 1947, Superintendent Eipen prepared the first audio tour of the museum with a gramophone record, which was made in Tamil, of the special exhibition on corals. Quote, "This record was played to a small group of visitors, and their reactions were carefully watched by me and the scientific staff." Bit creepy. A permanent audio tour was planned for the archaeological exhibits, in particular the Hindu gallery, with information planning to be played in intervals in Telugu, Tamil, and Malayalam. And here you see in red the intended locations of the gramophone player and the speaker. And unfortunately, this never came to fruition. And the gods began to move again because of one of the most important developments in any museum, the gift shop. I love that this sign says, "Explanations will help you. Begin with these." I could use that in pretty much any context. But it's one of my favorite signs. By at least 1936, picture postcards of the conserved gods were available for purchase. Priced at 1 anna each, these images were likely beyond the purchasing power of most visitors, but revenue from these postcard sales in the 30s and 40s suggests that between 1,200 and 2,000 postcards were sold annually and possibly functioned as portable devotional images of once portable devotional images. I have to marvel at the kind of liveness that these bronze images have, in part due to the conservation process that made them legible and gleaming again, and in part due to the other technological tools that make the work of that conservation process more visible. One might argue that a slide projector, a gramophone player, a printing press, all tools that we still use in some form in conservation, have then this very long history. After all, you're looking at my slides, you're hearing me through a microphone, and in the gift shop, you too might buy a postcard of what you've seen here at the museum. These tools then broaden our understanding and expectations of what conservation is or what it could be. Conservation might then be about changing people's experience of the world by bringing things back to life, by circulating them again, by being touched or passed from hand to hand until the edge of a postcard is worn from use. I have suggested thus far that conservation might have a role in bringing things back to life. And I think this is particularly possible when things remain in some way in their original context, or when there are descendant communities who might integrate these things back into their lives in ways that make sense for them. But what about the objects in our museums that are often severed from their originating communities and their original contexts, both in space and time? Can we really speak of bringing things back to life, or can we only perpetuate a kind of afterlife, a life after the ones previously lived? I think the University Museum has a role in this kind of work, to make things that once functioned elsewhere function again in this new context. My own home institution, the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum, was founded in 1882 with the express intention of teaching with things. Though most early acquisitions were objects found in and around Baltimore, this changed in 1887 with the arrival of several ancient Athenian ceramics. Hopkins classicist Arthur L. Frothingham Jr. wrote to the university's president, Daniel Coit Gilman, that he had managed to buy, quote, a superb series of 10 red-figured vases signed by well-known Greek artists for the museum. Red figure refers to ancient Greek ceramics featuring usually red figures and are dated between the late 6th to the 4th centuries BCE. Among the vases Frothingham brought back was this cup signed by someone we only know as Phintias. You see a fragmentary inscription that begins here that says, Phintias Egrapsan, Phintias painted it. And Phintias, there are only 7 known pots with Phintias' signature, and this individual is considered an important avant-garde painter of the late Archaic period, and thought to be a teacher of someone the Greek vase literature calls the Berlin painter, a painter of astonishing prowess. But we know little of Phintias besides this name, as there's no corroborating skeletal or archaeological evidence that tells us who he, she, they were, and in fact, we don't know who any of these ceramic artisans really were. This pot is also internationally known for the picture it carries, that of a young man, identified by his peach fuzz, I think you can see it there, it's astonishing in person, selecting ceramics in a potter's shop, perhaps in preparation for his first symposium. The symposium is well known as that all-male drinking party of the Athenian elite, and these vessels, functional pots, containers meant to be filled with something, presumably wine, and drunk from, are closely associated in the scholarship with the experiences of these elite men. But in 2014, I was interested in how these types of objects were made, and it was Phintias who helped me recruit the right expertise. When I first asked Master Potter Matthew Heilich if he would be willing to co-teach a course called Recreating Ancient Greek Ceramics with me, he refused. It seems to be a trend here. But then I invited him to hold the Phintias cup. And a few short months later, we were pounding fire clay to build our own replica of an ancient Athenian updraft kiln. With 13 undergraduate students in majors as diverse as physics, mathematics, material science, archaeology, we spent one breathless semester attempting to make replicas of Greek red figure ceramics. If you're interested, our work is documented on the class blog and in a short film called Mysteries of the Kylix, and the URLs are given here. As we were making new vessels, we often looked at the vases in the Hopkins collection in bewilderment. How did the ancients paint these detailed images in thinned clay? How could you produce these detailed images freehand? Well, actually, these ancient artisans, as skilled as they were, did not work freehand. They drew first drafts on the surfaces of still damp clay vessels before they painted them, and some of these drawings are still visible. But I have to give credit to my own draftsperson, seen here under the watchful eye of his younger sister supervisor, for alerting me to the importance of preparatory drawings. Ceramics production in ancient Athens was more an economic activity than a purely artistic one, and when our team received Johns Hopkins Discovery Grant to undertake an additional 10 test firings of our kiln, I knew I needed a team. I was primarily in charge of painting, and I was responsible for putting images on nearly 200 objects. And I can't draw. So I subcontracted this work to my 6-year-old, who at the time had a penchant for sharks, and willingly drew them on a few pots. But growing weary, he gave me a drawing and suggested that I transfer sharks onto pots by tracing over them. I'm not saying this is how ancient Greek artisans worked, it's just our method. This tracing method, or any drawing on wet clay, leaves distinct marks, raising burrs on the surface that we do not see on ancient Athenian pots. But when these drawings are painted over with thinned clay or burnished, they take on a topography similar to ancient surfaces, and they are visible enough to guide the painter, but subtle enough to disappear. Since 2015, I've been using a photographic technique called reflectance transformation imaging to document these tool marks, using digital images and computer algorithms to track these drawings. A brief introduction to this research is currently published on the Getty's blog, if you're interested. Consider, for example, the RTI dataset, which I hope will play. Yes. For a vessel fragment from the Getty collection attributed to an artisan identified by scholars as the Brigos painter, who was active between 490 and 470 BCE. The RTI allows us to clearly see how this individual sketched at least 3 different hand positions for the figure of a youth holding a cord. So what do these tool marks tell us? Let me play that one more time, I think. So what do these tool marks tell us? I think they're evidence, whoop, that's not what I want to do. So what do these tool marks tell us? I think they're evidence of idiosyncratic tool choices used by specific individuals, and the shapes of their tool marks on these surfaces tell us about how much they pressed into the clay as they drew, how much they liked to draw, and what they sketched when no one else was looking. These are individual signatures in the way that the inscription Phintias painted it is a signature, and I believe these are specific people, even if we don't know their real names. And these signatures are recognizable if you know what drawing quirks you're looking for. While at the Getty in 2017, I imaged 2 nearly identical storage vessels attributed to someone called the Villa Giulia painter, who was active between 470 and 440 BCE. In this scene, Apollo playing a lyre is flanked by his mother Leto on the left and his sister Artemis on the right. A closer look at the drawings for the Apollo figures in both objects reveals an idiosyncratic approach to delineating the top of the face with a straight line, sketching in a beaked tip for the nose, and then rounding out the chin. And I hope you can see these slashes here. It's a little hard from my angle, but there's definitely a line and then a sort of slash. And it's not just Apollo who gets this treatment. All of the figures, in fact, have this very peculiar profile with the beaked nose. The last time I was here at Harvard, I was given the opportunity to study this water jar here in the collection, also attributed to the Villa Giulia painter. The object depicts a different scene than the images that we've just seen on the objects in the Getty, though once again we have a central male figure flanked by 2 female figures. And the RTI dataset reveals a striking similarity in drawing style, most notably in the way that the face profiles are laid out. So one of the Getty vessels is on the left, and the Harvard jar is on the right. And there again, I hope you can see, is the beaked nose. So what do these marks tell us? Or rather, about whom do they tell us something? Greek scholars acknowledge that a significant proportion of the artists potting and painting in ancient Athens were classified as metics, resident aliens, a group clearly marked as non-Athenian, a diverse group that included economic migrants, skilled craftswomen, wealthy political asylees, refugees, and freed slaves. Over the time period when Phintias was painting to when the Villa Giulia painter and the Brigos painter worked, Athens introduced increasingly restrictive controls on this migrant population, marking them with the status of only living with Athenians, but without the possibility of ever becoming Athenian. Scholars write of the level of instability the Metic population lived with as perpetual outsiders, sometimes for generations. Last year, scholar Mario Iozzo published a hidden inscription scratched beneath the painted image on this vase attributed to the Berlin painter. The inscription was never meant to be seen except by someone else working with the Berlin painter, and it is a fragment of epic poetry relating to the image above it. Iozzo suggests that it might have functioned as a kind of shorthand between the master and the apprentice, in this case, the pupil being the Berlin painter and the master being none other than Phintias, whom we've met already. If indeed the inscription was written by Phintias, then its unusual Greek script might tell us something real about Phintias, because the script suggests the Greek of Elis in the Peloponnese. If this is Phintias, then Phintias came to Athens from Elis, a metic, a migrant worker. If ceramics then are so associated with the elite Athenians, are actually literally inscribed with the evidence of migrant labor, can we still call these Athenian objects? Could these objects be considered as much evidence of a migrant material culture as an ancient Athenian one? Looking again at the image of this cup, I have had to wonder if the tool marks we see, the drawing on the arms, the scraping away of the profile of the head, are marks of tools Phintias might have carried with him, her, them, all the way from the other side of the Peloponnese. And this young man, always thought of as an Athenian man, could he be instead a mirror image of a young alien, Phintias himself, if he was a man, or perhaps someone Phintias knew? The hidden inscription seems to speak to the image above it. And the image is that of the hero Theseus flinging down the bandit Sciron from the rocky cliffs of Megara, an actual place one would have passed through on the long journey from the western side of the Peloponnese onto the way to Athens. Is this just a mythic story or lived experience of a specific place, of a specific robbery that occurred along the way? How much of this image might itself be a document of the process of migration through a cultural landscape? Jason DeLeon, in his work on migration across the United States-Mexico border, writes about the containers that people carry on their perilous journey across the Sonoran Desert. Water bottles, though mass-produced and discarded as they are depleted, show evidence of use-wear. These vessels are modified by their users in idiosyncratic ways, telling us about specific individual circumstances of suffering and hope, even if their names are lost to us. For DeLeon, these objects also tell us about the way the difficult landscape imprinted itself on the bottles. The specificity of place is also part of the material culture left behind. So in considering Greek vases then as containers modified through use-wear, modified by their migrant workers walking through an actual landscape, I can't help but wonder how much of these objects then represents this difficult passage. Do they represent then a hoped life after the difficult passage, the afterlife? My daily walk to work at the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum takes me through an urban forest. 11 years of walking and noticing this land has made me think about my own connection to place as a settler on Piscataway land, as an immigrant to this country. And spring is a glorious time of year with everything bursting with renewed life. After months of restoration to our stream this year, several hundred toads came to breed along it, singing loudly for much of early April with a sound that was audible any time I entered the forest. A couple of weeks ago, my children found one of these toads far from the safety of the forest, run over by a speeding car on our street, its inside squeezed out, much to their horror and fascination. My children, along with 3 others, immediately organized themselves to bury this tiny migrant in the grass along our sidewalk. With the toad placed in a small burial plot in the damp earth, one of them said, "We need a tombstone." And with the need of a tombstone came the need for a name. My son improvised a Post-it note and taped it to a stone marker. "Here lies Toady." I promise you it had nothing to do with any of this. I was simply sitting on the porch steps, feeling a mixture of awe and tenderness. And over the next few days, offerings to Toady appeared in the form of glitter and cuttings of green vines. Even the trees seemed to put out their offerings. People stopped to remark on this small grave. They pulled out phones and took pictures. At a neighborhood park cleanup, people we had never met before were talking about Toady. In fact, Toady's grave marker came to mark where we lived, as in, "Oh, you live by Toady." April brings with it its lashings of rain, and so the brave Post-it note that marked Toady's existence and maintained Toady in our collective memory faded. But this last weekend, we used some of my conservation tools to practice a different kind of veneration, to state again more legibly the fact of Toady's existence and the importance of our participation in perpetuating this tiny life story. This human tendency, or perhaps need to mark, to acknowledge that someone else was here, is something I think about often, because in our storage spaces and even out on view in our museum displays are these traces of human lives, of places, of landscapes, and the complex networks of relationships that made them possible. Our tools and practices can, and in my view, must engage more with these stories and histories, because our work is not primarily a visual endeavor or a scientific endeavor, it is a human being endeavor, or perhaps just a being endeavor. Our peculiar work is perhaps not to allow things and people to necessarily rest in peace forever, but rather to let them rest more comfortably in our care for as long as they need to, catching their breath, regaining their strength, before beginning the next part of their journeys in the afterlife. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanchita. we can take some questions, but maybe we can sit down
Proceed
and
to the red chairs.
yeah, I'll sit on the siren and chairs and
Wow, it's very official looking.
yeah. So, does anybody have any questions that they would like to direct towards Sanchita? Okay, so maybe I can start off then. So it occurred to me that our training as conservators is very much as scientists, and what we do is we take emotion out of everything. And that's a legacy, I think, in many ways of George Stout, who wanted conservation to be a scientific discipline. But what you're able to do is reinsert emotion and feelings into the work we do, and you take intellectual risks that pay out emotionally by weaving themes and making these connections. And I'm just wondering, in your, like once you left NYU, was there an aha moment where you're like, I need to reinsert feelings into my work so that it's a complete thing?
No, I think it's that the feelings are always there. It's just according to our professional sort of practice, we're not allowed to acknowledge them, which seems rather strange. In our field, we have this concept of collections care, which ironically seems to be about pretending that you don't really care what happens, that it's all just a sort of series of experiments. And I've found that very strange for a long time. And I think it does the people whose things we're asked to care for a great disservice to say we have no emotional attachment to them. I think that's really an important part of the work we're meant to do.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Stunned you into silence.
Tony.
Well, one of the manifestations of that tendency.
Just wait for the big.
One of the manifestations of that tendency in the profession of conservation is reflected in our principal journal in this country, the Journal of the American Institute for Conservation, which mandates that thou shalt not write in anything but the third person. Therefore, if you're describing a treatment, you're literally taking yourself out of the activity completely. So what do you think about that? And would you suggest that maybe we not do that?
I mean, I think there's so many different ways that one could approach documentation now that there's no need to only have one way. And this actually came up at a different conference where people were saying, well, how do we actually keep track of what we're doing if we're supposed to be more empathetic? What do we do with the way that we've been trained to write down what we've done? Because part of my frustration with looking at old reports, for example, because objects are treated and retreated over and over again. You're usually not the first person to get to something except for maybe on an excavation. And you have this long history of narratives about re-adhered this piece with this glue. And it's always very technical, which is an important part of it, but it's also very cold. And I find myself rather frustrated by this seeming, lack of interest in the well-being of things. So I would say there are different ways, there are different registers in which we could make this documentation more empathetic. One absolutely has to have all of the kind of cold images and descriptions of what was done, but there are other places where we could put this information in. For example, in our museum now, there's always a space for rationale for treatment, and why did you at least make the decision? At least explain that part. But I'm really impressed by exciting new ways in which digital and database documentation is being kind of rethought by indigenous communities in particular, who have been creating new forms of databases that are about maintaining these stories and the histories and things like songs that went along with how objects were used. And that, all that sort of intangible stuff is actually recorded as allowing this object to be preserved for the future. So I think there are lots of different ways. We just have to, be willing to think a little bit differently, or have kind of multiple ways in which we document the same thing.
Thanks, Sanchita. First, I just want to acknowledge how, in the kind of crafting of your talk itself, you performed a lot of the ethical considerations that you've asked us to sort of think about in our own practices. And I think as an artist and as a professor, it's the amount of reflection that you've done on the kind of principles and methods of your craft, and the way that you've acknowledged not only what makes it possible for you to work through the objects that you worked with and the histories, but also the institutions and the land that we're standing on, I think is really, it's kind of a model for how I think any discipline can use these types of contexts to rehearse a kind of reflexivity. So I thank you for that. As a practicing artist, I feel some really interesting tensions watching this. You know, I mean, on the one hand, I think that there's such a kind of a massive like empty space that you're starting to fill in around some of these objects. And yet, especially frankly as an artist of color, there are questions of how biography, how you want or don't want biography to inform the perception of a work. And I know this is a kind of huge field, but I actually wonder in relationship to your care for and display of objects, either in your practice, or can you think out loud even about how to kind of present some of the information that you're talking about that both gives a kind of autonomy to the object and lets the work shine through, and at the same time allows people to access the kinds of information that you're discovering?
I wish I knew how to answer that. I don't know. I feel like every project takes on a new form. I think for me, I understand what you're saying about wanting the biography and the thing to remain separate. And I think that's very feasible when you have an artist who can actually craft that biography. And for me, you know, I'm really troubled by the fact that a lot of these biographies have never been considered worthy of writing down. And especially, I think, in the study on Greek vases, there's been a real narrowing of who these people are. And certainly the people working on, I think, Greek history, ancient Greek history, I mean, I'm such a fan of some of these people who are finally writing other people into the story of what ancient Athens was like. And I can't unsee the fact that these people, we might actually have evidence of where some of these people were from. For me, it changes the story. I don't think it changes necessarily the way that I receive their extraordinary work. I mean, they're incredible artists, that's without a doubt. So it doesn't matter to me where they came from in terms of how I understand their virtuosity. But in terms of a bigger picture of who's crafting and what these images actually might reflect, or how differently these images might be interpreted as opposed to what we've come to understand them to be, to me that is absolutely essential. But I'm still on the lookout. I'm only a little bit down the road.
Question up there.
Sorry, it's a long run.
Thank you.
If I might take the liberty to try to extend what you're talking about, because I'm not in the conservatory business, but one of the places where I see the problem you raise is when we record folklore of other peoples. Very often you may record sort of the literal rendition of what happened, but what people feel and the story behind what they felt and the story that they brought to them doesn't seem to record it. And how would you think we might be able to do that?
I mean, for me, ideally, people record themselves for their own purposes. I mean, I think that's essentially one of the biggest problems. I mean, we have this unfortunately long legacy. You know, anthropology has been struggling with it for decades. How do we actually make sense of the fact that people go out and kind of, you know, capture this information and take it away? And, you know, what does that mean about that capturing process? And here too, looking at contemporary indigenous work on how to actually preserve the stories for their own purposes and not for access for anyone. It's for themselves. I mean, I think that kind of sovereignty and autonomy is incredibly important. And that's the only way to get to something that feels authentic to the people who really need it.
So, Sanchita, I wanted to ask you about a project you worked on with reconstructing a pair of mummies' faces.
Yeah.
Because they're in the collection, they're described as objects. And what you're able to do was you were able to dignify their existence in a way that doesn't happen with how people think about mummies. And I just thought you could describe that project.
Sure. In 2007, the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum was actually closing down for renovation, and there was a need to actually care for this ancient individual who's been actually part of the Hopkins collection on loan since the 1980s. And so I conserved this woman because she had been unfortunately unwrapped. We don't really have information on when she was unwrapped, I think in multiple stages. And so I'd spent, 3 weeks in a basement just sitting with this ancient person, which is, I think, what kind of started me off on all of this, why aren't we acknowledging the feelings that we have? Because you can't sit with a person for that long and not have some kind of emotional reaction. And I was actually doing things with her body. I was making sure that the wrappings were as intact as possible. And at the time, this individual had become part of Hopkins lore. She had been described as Boris, for Boris Karloff, who played the mummy, because when she was CT scanned at Hopkins Hospital in 1988, since she did not have a social security number, they had to put a name onto the medical data. And my director, who's an Egyptologist, said, well, Boris, right? And so Boris actually turns out to be a woman. I was working on this individual for a long time, and finally she went back on view in the new iteration of our museum after some, discussions about whether this is the right place for an individual to be. And I was really ambivalent about it. And one part of me thought, well, if this person is in this space, someone has to acknowledge her. Someone has to, pay attention to her. And that was my kind of uneasy way of being okay with it. And then it turned out we had another individual, also ancient Egyptian, who had been autopsied at Hopkins Hospital. So, the sort of changes that had happened to these individuals really fit with changes in medical technology and what one could suddenly do. And the autopsy in 1979 actually basically disassembled this individual. And a lot had been written about both of these people, who they were, what they were like. It was, kind of my frustration with this constant Boris talk. It was really driving me nuts. That I thought, well, I've got to do something about this. And I happened to be in conversation with Caroline Wilkinson. If you've never seen her work, she works for Face Lab at John Moores John Moores University in Liverpool. She's a forensic scientist and artist, and her job is to actually make digital reconstructions of the ancient dead, but also the war dead of World War I, World War II. She's an absolutely extraordinary person. And her team said, well, we'd be interested in something. And it was really this extraordinary opportunity to then use all of these scientific tools, which in previous decades had been used to really take these people apart, to sort of try and bring them back together again. And because it's a very interdisciplinary project that involved graduate students, undergraduate students, Egyptologists, all of these different medical imaging people, digital imaging people, our friends in Liverpool, osteologists, all of these different people, we were able to start to gather all of this information that allowed us to actually kind of reimagine who these people were. And Face Lab actually, they would send us kind of these representations of these people. And it was always sort of terrifying because you would get this email and there'd be a JPEG and it would be a little terrifying. Who am I going to see? And the initial versions were very robotic. They looked kind of like androids. And that was very upsetting to a lot of us because that wasn't the point of this project. But as we learned more and more about these people through their remains, we were able to say, oh, well, these two individuals are women. They were both in their 40s. One of these individuals, was in really excellent physical shape, and the other individual had all of these other problems with especially her teeth, poor thing. But the best part for me was one of these individuals both of them came in a coffin. One was discarded because it was considered a gaudy case in 1895. But the other coffin we still have, and again, using some of our digital imaging tools, I was able to study it with some graduate students, and we found the name of one of these people. Can't see it in normal light, but using visible infrared luminescence, a name showed up, and her name is Amanirdis. And I can't tell you how powerful that moment is, because for one, you never know. I mean, who is Phintias, right? Who's the Brigos painter? I don't know who these people are. But if this is actually that individual's coffin, and this is in fact Amanirdis, to me that was, I think, one of the most important things that I've ever done. And that particular name is attested to the time period in which this individual is dated. So part of the work then is to really say, this individual life is worth pursuing, because that's just what I'm here for. I think I've struggled a lot about, well, what does this tell us about Egyptology, sort of more, broadly written? And I don't know. I just know that it tells us about Amanirdis, and that was actually worth doing. And you can see both of their faces. They're really lovely. You can see them on our website.
Thank you, Dr. Balachandran. I'd like to echo what the person a few questions ago said about how important the presentation you gave was, both in the material and in the sensitivity. So I'm grateful for that. This is a striking image to end on, because I'm starting to think about future generations of artists too, and your children as examples of tender creators of archives. And it's making me start to think more about how do we responsibly even share these images. When I think of Phintias the painter versus Toady the massacred toad, I think about what do we use as a markers of description? So with Phintias, do we use his name, as you mentioned, or the Berlin painter, or do we mention what's on the object? And does that help us also determine where in the museum it goes? Does it go in an exhibit about medics? Does it go in an exhibit about the symposium? And with Toady as well, I think about it. When we have these people or creatures who were seen as unimportant in the scheme of things, how do we reconcile or rehabilitate art so that it can have a wider audience? It's something that I work on Greek pottery that I struggle with. How much do we think about people being organized by categories that we prefer versus categories that would have resonated in antiquity?
I mean, I think this is what, living with some of the archives that I've lived with, especially the archive in India, has made really clear, the kind of arbitrariness of all of these categories, right? Someone has made them up and decided that they're worth perpetuating for however long. And here too, I think especially the work of indigenous scholars says these categories don't fit at all with the worldview that, makes sense for us. And so I think we're in this really exciting moment where suddenly the categories don't need to make sense the way that they always have. It's, I think, a moment of great discomfort for some. And in general, it's discomforting because honestly, if we get rid of all of these categories, especially for the Greek vase painters, well, who the heck are they? I don't know how to explain any of their relationships. So in some ways you can't discard them entirely, but I think being able to have this kind of interrogation and then perhaps come up with the next iteration of a classification system that still refers and understands how the previous classification system works is really helpful, because if you understand the parameters, it's a lot easier to kind of disrupt them, right? It's like, once, I just made this joke earlier, once you know there's a matrix, like everything else becomes clear. Right? So how do you know what you're functioning in? And I think for me, entering into all of these different categories of things has been a constant relearning process. Where do these things fit? And what does it make me as a conservator want to do with them? And really, what do I owe them? Because ultimately, these categories don't reflect anything about their lives. They reflect my life. So what's the next category that's going to make sense? And I think we have to be comfortable with the fact that it never fits with what they wanted. But I think that's still worth pursuing.
And I was going to say too that you had an interesting moment up in the labs where you were talking about the challenge of understanding the gender of the painters as well, because we make assumptions all the time about the gender of painters. We found out that the person with lapis lazuli in her teeth was a woman. And they were painting medieval manuscripts. And are you finding the same thing?
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited about this. Thank you, Ryan. How did you know that? So this is one of the really exciting things about reading, I think, feminist scholars working in the classical world, because they're really interested in how we can kind of bring women back into the story. And Rebecca Futo-Kennedy, who works on immigrant women in Athens, her book says, since there's a specific tax category for women medics, they're taxed in order to do their professions. Why would we not assume that there are enough of these women in Athens that why wouldn't one of them necessarily be then a potter or a painter? And I've run into this kind of confusion about why, at least in the Greek vase literature, it seems people assume women are there. They're definitely around, but they're definitely not doing the most important jobs. And we have, few images of women working. And unfortunately for me, one of the frustrations is they're described as doing kind of secondary things or helping their husbands or, that sort of thing. But if there's a separate tax category for these women workers, why couldn't we imagine them as subcontractors or even running their own, practices? But we don't know. But just not having hard evidence doesn't mean we have to foreclose that possibility. There's really exciting work being done by Julie Hruby, who's looking at whether fingerprint evidence allows us to start to track women or children in these different workshops. And, she's doing really interesting work. I myself am I'm very nervous about trying to assign gender or any other kind of ethnicity, any other kind of classification based on these sorts of they're very complex traces. They're just use-ware traces. What do we make of them? But I think it's important to leave open the possibility that these other people were there, because without that, we're stuck with the same narrative, and I think that's far too limiting.
So there's one last question, and then we'll close the session.
Speaking a little bit more about the death of objects, how do you reconcile deaccessioning and the whole process of deciding what's worth keeping and what's worth staying within museums that's kind of separate from conservation, but is a part of conservation in terms of the whole museum practice?
Well, I'm a conservator, so I want to keep everything. When I worked on excavations, I was notorious for wanting to keep absolutely everything, which in retrospect, of course, I now realize that was impossible. But, if you've taken something into your care, it's difficult to say it's not worth caring for anymore. I can't speak for any other institution, but at the Hopkins Archaeological Museum, we have things that are accessioned that probably most other people would not consider accessioning. But I think there's something really important about those traces. What if just the random sherds or the handles or, God knows what else we have, all sorts of random bits and pieces. There's something to be learned from them. And because I'm working specifically within a university context, there is some value to those things that, really doesn't allow me to consider deaccessioning. But I think this is different for different institutions and they make their own decisions. But for me personally, I think there's always something to be learned. There's always something to be investigated. And when there isn't, you just put it aside and wait until someone comes by and says, I want to work on that thing. What is that?
And actually, just to that point, I just attended a conference where a student was studying mortars, and it's the space between the building bricks. And what they were finding is that there's significance in the stuff that people were discarding because they thought it just had no information, but in fact it was full of information about where the stuff that made up the mortar came from and told you a lot about the building process. So even though we don't know its value now, it doesn't mean that there's some value down the line for somebody. So we have to be so careful about what we decide to get rid of. We just don't know what we're going to find out that is actually critical and important down the road.
And I think, this really, this was something I was considering putting in the talk, but it seemed like there were a lot of things in it already. But I'm really interested in thinking about cultural products as trash. And this is something Jason DeLeon's work, whose work I pointed out, does incredibly well, is really saying, for example, these water bottles that get discarded along this perilous route. We might just think it's just a bunch of water bottles, it's just trash. And what he really does in his work is he rehabilitates this trash as really evidence of this useware. So I've been teaching all semester, thank goodness it's the last week of teaching. But last week I exhausted my poor students because I gave them a lot of readings about preserving cultural heritage that isn't nice or pretty or is in fact dangerous, like our nuclear waste. We have nuclear sites that are now national parks that need to be preserved. Some of them cannot be approached because they're radioactive. We have all kinds of other trash that we produce that is our cultural heritage, right? Plastic, we made it, it's our cultural product. And so we're constantly kind of deciding what cultural heritage is based on, again, some category of acknowledged value. And to me, this is exactly what we need to kind of respond to by saying, we actually produce this. This is our responsibility to care for it. Now, how we do that, I don't know. It's going to require, really thoughtful and difficult thinking. But the idea that something might be just trash, to me, is just no longer a viable option.
Thank you. So please join me in thanking Sanchita for a really fascinating evening.